This 4-minute video took me over 800 hours to create, and I don't regret any of the time it took me to forge this thing into existence. I don't have the funds or the resources to make bigger, more elaborate projects, so this idea I felt would stretch my skills within the current circumstances I'm in, and also lockdown restrictions. This was the perfect project for me to take on. My artist statement for these last 3 years has been to pursue a concept or an idea to the highest degree with playing within my means and network. For this shoot, I co-wrote, directed it, performed in, edited on a €400 budget. Aside from the other actor on set, I had another friend of mine helping me out with the 2 days shoot, which meant I was basically in front of the camera and behind the camera at all times. My goal was to make a music video which would stand out amongst all the other low budget, story lacking music videos on YouTube, which in my opinion, for whatever that's worth, are generally just a bunch of B-roll and performance shots stitched together without any real sense of character, story or concept. So it had to be really tight storytelling if it was to make an impression on the YouTube algorithm. Every second would have to be planned out before the production days, and I couldn't leave anything to creative choice or a happy accident. However, the best moments in the piece for me are those which we discovered during the actual shooting. This idea was based off a genre of music called Bardcore and Tavern Wave, which consists of medieval-inspired remakes of rap and hip-hop music. Upon discovering Bardcore, I thought it was so innovative and clever, and I scoured the entire internet to find as many covers as I could. I'd gone down the rabbit hole, so to speak. Some of these Shakespeare-inspired lyrics contributed in the comment sections were truly outstanding, and it got me thinking whether there might be a creative idea within this. Then, like all great ideas that come to the artist out of nowhere, from somewhere deep within the subconscious, which you've got to trust, I thought I could push this concept further by producing a narrative rap style music video with adapted rap lyrics in early modern English and Shakespearean English. Once this idea had caught my attention, the song choice to cover became obvious to me. GANGSTA'S Paradise by Coolio. I discovered a fantastic instrumental of this song by a YouTuber that goes by the name of Beetle the Bardcore. I thought that this instrumental had the potential to be made into a great story. Most of you guys might be aware of Weird Al's version of GANGSTA'S Paradise, Amish Paradise, which he made back in 1996. While this is a really clever concept and obviously quite humorous, I felt it lacked a certain story element which I thought I could incorporate into my own Bardcore version. We've been in lockdown here in Ireland for almost the entire year. So I wondered, how was I going to get this project off the ground considering all these restrictions that are going on. I'd also been playing around with green screening technique during the summer because of this, and so here's some interesting foresight I had for this film in my last YouTube video. The idea of making a short film entirely made up of green screen footage was then planted in my mind. If I could learn how to produce high production value looking shorts, sketches or scenes with just basic green screen footage, that would be a great success. So with this idea ruminating in the back of my mind, I was looking for interesting backdrop footage to inspire this green screen based film I would make. I just happened to watch a couple of episodes from season 1 of Netflix's The Witcher, and I was hit with the thought that there might be some possible scenes in episode 1 and 3 that would perfectly fit with the potential I'd want to create in my Bardcore and GANGSTA'S Paradise idea. Upon reviewing these scenes from The Witcher, I felt they were ideal for the idea and the world that I was starting to envision. The only issue was, would I be able to remove the actors from the frame whilst also keeping the extras in the background? This skill set was out of my range, and I wasn't sure if it was even possible for me to do. So if I couldn't successfully treat these background shots to a high standard, I wouldn't be able to make this film using this kind of green screen technique. So I gave myself 2 weeks of experimentation to see if I could do it. If I couldn't get decent results by the end of this experimentation, I dropped the whole project entirely. The key tool that would make all this possible was the content-aware fill within Adobe After Effects. While this is a very powerful program indeed, it never seems to work perfectly or in the way that you want it to. If you want to render flawless results, let's just say removing an actor from a scene, for example, generally speaking, one might have to go frame by frame, almost repainting the entire shot. However, through the dynamic link between Photoshop and After Effects, this can be all made possible, and the two programs work together trying to guess what it is you want to remove from the footage. Essentially what you're doing in Photoshop is repainting the areas that After Effects messed up on. So after about 2 or 3 weeks working with these practice shots, going back and forth between After Effects and camera test shoots, I achieved a standard that I was really happy with. And now I felt there was great potential in actually pulling this project off. During the summer, I stumbled upon this all-in-one workstation application and task manager called Notion. Up until this point, I'd been keeping written notes in notebooks for all creative endeavors and other projects. I was looking for a piece of software that would serve me better than handwritten notes for quite a while, as I'm profoundly dyslexic, and it's of prime importance that I stay as organized as possible, as I'm privy to lose sight or not stay on top of creative projects I am currently working on without carefully planning at all stages. Notion was the ideal workspace for this project, I believed, and this film had many moving parts and many experiments that I needed to go through, that needed to be reviewed and catalogued as I was working my way through the production. Notion is set up in such a way that it makes it very easy for creatives to interact with their material. So if you want to see that, comment down below and I might make a separate video on this topic in the future. From the first draft of the script to the final YouTube upload, this was all organized within Notion. Apart from the other programs I used to craft this piece, such as the Adobe Suite, Fruity Loops, Resolve 16, this was the only other note-taking software I used during the production. One great lesson I learned from making my previous films is the importance of folder organization with digital files to stay on top of your film. I think that Notion has changed the way in which I think and create projects, as it supports my way or your way of thinking as if it were a second brain to help with your creativity. So it's a really great app. The music and the green screen footage gave me suggestions of what the story might be. The main concept in the original Gangsters Paradise music video is Michelle Pfeiffer's character, Leon Johnson, comes to Coolio's lair hideout in the hopes of ending his reign of gangster terror. She then presents a younger, innocent version of Coolio to himself, and he's changed by this interaction, presumably by the boy's good nature that he can still see in himself. I wanted to use this similar concept or storyline in my own version, and the logline of my film script goes as follows. A childhood friend of a notorious criminal seeks him out in the hopes of ending his reign of terror. One of the cliches of screenwriting is once you got your logline down, all the other elements of your story would come together. This cliche actually happened to be true in my case during this production. Once I settled on this logline, I could see the whole story in my head, and so the script came together in one evening of writing because of this. Now that the general arc of my film was coming together, I knew who I'd like to play the Michelle Pfeiffer role in the story, as I would obviously be playing the criminal counterpart of Coolio because, well, I look evil and that is my casting type. My super talented actor friend Sam McGovern would be perfect for the role for a number of reasons. He's a very talented musician and singer. Our faces would complement each other within this narrative, and we'd previously spoke about collaborating on a project together at some stage. Once he emailed me back in regards to accepting the role, I was over the moon that he came on board because I felt he was the perfect collaborator to work on with this film. Now there was only the tremendously difficult task of writing the lyrics for the script. I had read quite a lot of Shakespeare and performed it in drama school, but I'd never actually tried writing anything in early modern English, let alone try to rap a song. However, I thought I did a decent first draft of the lyrics until Sam sent me back his take on it, and no sooner did I realize that Sam had actually studied early modern English in college, but he also had a great talent for writing as well. It was so good, in fact, that I knew that I hadn't the ability or the raw talent to improve the lyrics in any way at all. So now, thanks to Sam, we were in really good shape heading into pre-production. My time was split between pre-production and developing my character for this video. A great lesson I've learned from starring in my own films is that you're never just preparing for one thing. While you're working on one aspect of your film, such as the script, you're actually working on character at the same time. That's not to say I didn't spend a lot of time directly learning the lyrics and practicing my Northern English accent, for example, because I did. All this preparation that you're doing becomes an alchemy in a way to a better final product. I'm still in development of a system that will better serve me as an actor in regards to character. I have a long list of 100 complex questions I like to ask myself about any character I'm going to play for the screen. Then I read the script a few times daily, leading up to the event, letting the concept seep into my subconscious and the life of the character start to manifest itself within me. I also like to go on walks, just thinking about various aspects of the character. Then a couple of days leading up to the shoot, I'll try to imagine how every scene might play out beat by beat. If anyone's interested in the list of questions I've mentioned above, drop me a line and I'll share it in the comment section down below this video. My plan for this film was to make it the highest production quality I could. So I needed a solution for really clean audio without having to pay for a studio recording session, which would have cost me the entirety of the budget for this film. So I came up with this idea to design an acoustic foam box to house my condenser mic with some acoustic foam I had lying around the house. I thought this was a brilliant idea, only to find out after building this box that it had actually already been invented and it was quite cheap on Amazon for base models starting at $70. However, I'd made mine for free and I'd saved a little bit of money in the process. Sam is basically a professional musician. It was only natural that he would direct our performances on the days of the vocal recordings. And I'm an amateur guitarist and piano player at best. I'm still surprised how bad I am after all these years. However, I would play the role of sound engineer for the vocal recording sessions as I was more familiar with the hardware and software than Sam was. I completely underestimated how difficult rapping in a foreign accent in early modern English would be. Let's just say I really struggled with this part of the production. Not to mention, I had learned the lyrics in a rhythm that Sam did not intend it to be sung in. However, I eventually pulled it together and got a decent performance amongst many takes, thanks to Sam's patience. Without Sam's experience in this area, I wouldn't have performed as well as I did. Let's just say I'm not going to become a rapper anytime soon. Once we'd recorded some of the pickups from the first day, next we recorded Sam's lead vocals and chorus tracks. Sam completely knocked it out of the park in my opinion, which made me realize Thank God I never pursued a career in singing or music, as I don't have the raw talent or skill that Sam naturally does. All his takes were usable in my opinion, and we were afforded the great luxury of picking a great take amongst many, many takes. I've mixed a couple of songs using Fruity Loops over the last year or so, and so I was familiar with the program. However, I'd never mixed vocals to an instrumental before. And whilst it's similar to video editing in a way, which I have a lot of experience at, it's not totally alike. I spent 12 hours the day after the vocal recording session scouring the internet, looking at tutorials so I could best mix the vocals to my best ability with the knowledge that I currently had at the time. Sam came over to my house following day and we finalized the mix together, as he has a much greater ear than I have, so it was good that he made all the final calls. After a couple of drafts back and forth over email, we came to a version we were both very happy with. If anyone has seen my previous film, The Charm Controller, which I shot in a cowshed in my grandparents' farm, I decided that I was going to shoot this music video in the same location. As I've mentioned earlier in this video, 60% of the shots would be green screen footage and the other 40% of the shots would be shot with a backdrop of the location. However, the shed comes with some major drawbacks. It's fucking freezing and has these annoying troughs that are difficult to keep out of frame when shooting within this space. But it did have a couple of things going for it. It was a free location to shoot in our own time. I could have the lights set up as a stage before Sam and Sue came down for the shoot days to save us time, and it had enough space for us to shoot all the green screen footage within the one location. I gave myself 2 weeks of preparation before the actual shoot. I felt that would give me enough time to organize all the other elements ready for production on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th of December. This would also mean I wouldn't procrastinate on the various other jobs I needed to get done leading up to the shoot. I find that under a little bit of pressure, I'm better at solving problems that I wouldn't find solutions to otherwise. There would be 30 shots in total for the shoot. The plan was that we would shoot all the performance to camera shots on the first day, and on the second day all the green screen shots, and on the third day any pickups that we didn't get from the first 2 days. The logic here was to keep the setup times to a minimum, so I'd keep the amount of days of production down. The philosophy here is a pain in the ass to get everyone organized for a reshoot, and I don't mind spending the extra time during post-production if it means keeping the chances of days of production or reshoots as low as possible. I also think it leaves a bad taste with the crew if they end up doing more work than they've agreed upon when accepting the job. I knew this was going to be a very ambitious project for a crew of 2 to achieve, so my planning leading up to production was meticulous. €200 of the budget was spent on props and costume, and the rest of the budget was spent on camera equipment such as lights and green screen backdrops. I spent an entire week refining the lighting and set dressing prior to the shoot. I had to know the 30 different lighting setups off by heart, so when I got to production, I didn't have to think about the lighting or how I would frame the shots. I would simply know where everything needed to be via the guide pictures I'd uploaded to Notion. This saved me having to explain each setup to the crew. They could simply follow along with the instructions I'd laid out for all of us using Notion. For the wanted poster in the teen's bedroom, I researched a lot of Byzantine art to get a good reference of what I might create. The audience would have to make out it was me on the poster, as the shot was going to be on screen for only a second or so. So instead of a black and white drawing, which was my initial plan, I decided to go with a mosaic design. I then took a still of my face and imposed it to a classical Byzantine artwork called Justinina I from Saint Vital in Ravinia. Now I butchered that name, all of the names there, so I apologize. The history of this artwork also fit with the concept of the character of Coolio. Justinina was an outlaw himself who forcefully pushed the spread of Christianity along with the expansion of his own empire. The parchment was the key prop for this story to work, so it had to be equally as clear as the poster. This drawing needed to fill the backstory of both our characters, obvious that a child might have drawn it, and clearly showed two aspiring knights with their avatar names below each character. It will also have to work in a medium shot and a close-up. So after a few drafts in Photoshop, this is what I came up with. The camera I was using for this shoot was the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K with the Metabone Speed Booster. The lenses I used were the Sigma 18-35, a newer 85mm lens, and a 50mm 1.4 US-M lens. I'd also purchased a 1/4 black Pro Mist to bloom the highlights for the performance to camera shots. This gave the candles an interesting blooming effect and a slick sheen off my costume armor as well, which would fit with the overall aesthetic of what I was going for. A massive mistake I'd made with the green screen test shooting on location was using the black Pro Mist filter with these shots. Once I brought these shots into After Effects, I realized that the skin tones were smearing with the green screen in the background. This made it much more difficult to key in post-production. Thankfully, I learned this lesson during testing rather than the shoot itself. Due to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K's terrible battery life, I had four 12,000 milliwatt amp hour Sony MPF batteries that I cycled through on the shoot days. I would get about 2 hours of runtime out of each of these batteries. I had two external monitors on set, one on top of the camera, facing towards the actors so I could check my frame and focus while I was in front of the camera, you see. And another larger monitor on a light stand if viewing the frame was not ideal to have just above camera for certain shots. Take for example a profile shot where I could have the monitor facing me here as opposed to looking to the monitor this way. For the lighting setup I had three Fresnel lights. One 120D Mark I and two Godox 60 watt Fresnel lights. They're actually really good. The only problem with them is they're a little bit loud. I have one here and I think it's getting picked up on the mic a little bit. I generally use the spotlight for the hair light, and for the main key I was using a 90-inch softbox from Salons. These three lights almost completely covered me for almost all my lighting needs for the entire shoot. So all this planning with the lighting beforehand really paid off here. I was also using two Quasar lights by Yongnuo and a Falcon Eyes F7 light. I used these lights mainly for fill in the background as a kind of practical just out of shot with the 1/4 black Pro Mist. This would bloom the edges of frame in a cinematic way. The candlelight flicker effect from the Falcon Eyes light panel came in handy for quite a few shots as well. So I dedicated an entire week to green screen experimentation. This week went as follows. Monday was an on-location test. Tuesday was spent reviewing the footage and chroma keying back in After Effects. I followed this order until I finished testing by the Sunday evening. By the end of this week, I had come to the conclusion that I would have to shoot in a B-RAW codec if I wanted high quality green screened images. The initial plan was to shoot in 10-bit ProRes due to After Effects not having the built-in settings to adjust the RAW functionality with the B-RAW codec. Throughout this last year and a half, I've shot almost every project with a B-RAW codec. I would have liked to use DaVinci Resolve for this entire project, but the tools within the Fusion tab are not yet powerful enough at chroma keying to achieve a cinematic image that looks realistic enough for what I wanted to achieve. So I decided to bite the bullet and pay €60 for a B-RAW plugin for Premiere Pro and After Effects. Utilizing the 12-bit color depth and RAW functionality in post gave me room to make mistakes on the shoot days which I was going to inevitably make either way, considering the low budget and the amount of people on set. Using the B-Raw codec meant I could relight any green screen footage in post-production. I believe this is the key decision in regards to upping the production value of the film. I did make a couple of small lighting mistakes during production, which I could now relight in post-production. Reflecting on the shoot, if I had shot it in 10-bit ProRes, the production value would have been a lot lower. I'll go into further detail about the arduous process of dealing with green screen footage in the editing section of this BTS video, although I did really enjoy the green screen process. So I tried to set up everything on the Friday before the start of the production, with all the gear and props ready to go for the entire shoot. This meant I dressed the set and set up for as many of the shots as I could to free up as much time as I could during the days of production. While low budget productions like this one will most certainly involve cutting many corners, the most important thing, I believe, is to be as organized as possible and to have everything rehearsed in your head beforehand, so when the crew and actors come on board for the production, all they experience is the joy and collaboration and not the hard work and frustration it took to solve all the other annoying problems right before you went into production. However, this idea works great in theory, but you shouldn't kid yourself into thinking other problems won't arise on the production itself, as this is an inevitable part to making literally any film. It took me 12 hours by myself to set up for the production on that Friday. The first day of production got off to a great start. Everyone seemed to be really enjoying themselves and we were in a really creative flow. The performances were pretty decent overall and we were quickly making our way through the shot list with great ease. My plan was to cover some of the outside green screen shots that day as well, as the weather was fairly overcast, which made it ideal for shooting the green screen shots, you see. However, on that fateful day, the weather was fairly changeable. I would also need to use a hair light for Sam for the second shot, so I could match the continuity of it with the Witcher shot. So I brought an extension lead outside for the light. As soon as we started shooting, it started to drizzle and we were rushing to get the shot before it started to really pour. We then very quickly moved all the camera gear inside to save it from getting wet, and once we brought the equipment back into the shed, the power completely cut and I was worried I'd blown a fuse, or worse, I'd gotten a cable wet and that the power was cut indefinitely or something like that. My uncle actually lives at this location in the house beside the shed, and the power in the house had gone as well. So for the next 3.5 hours, my uncle and I were trying to figure out how to get the power back in the shed and its house. I was losing precious time for the production, which I wouldn't be able to get back on our limited budget. And my uncle had no power in his house either, which made me feel really bad for causing all this hassle for him. We reset all the switches on the fuse box and the power was still down. Things were really not looking good. And I started looking into ways of sourcing a generator so we could keep working on the production for tomorrow. Thankfully, we figured out the problem after some thorough investigation. It was all due to a dodgy extension lead I'd used for my outside lighting setup, which shorted the power. Once we removed this extension lead from the equation and reset the switches on the fuse box once again, the power came back and we could finally get back up and running after 3 hours of a delay. Since we lost so much time on the first day of shooting, it meant we would have to extend the shooting period to another day. Unfortunately, our assistant director and camera operator wasn't free for an extra day of the shoot for that week. So Sam and I would have to continue on the third day of production alone, which meant tomorrow would be our final day with an extra hand, and we'd have to prioritize all the shots that would need assistance for the next day. And then hopefully Sam and I could complete the rest of the production together without the need of an extra hand. Thankfully, the rest of the performance to camera shots went really well that evening, And after our first major hiccup, we all got back into the flow again, and I was really happy with the rest of the day's takes. So the new plan for the second day of production was to continue on with the performance to camera shots that we were meant to finish on the first day of shooting. Then we'd start on the green screen shots after break and try to cover as many of those shots as we could. We covered all the performance to camera shots just before lunch, which left us a little bit of time to set up for the green screen shots in the evening. This is where all my preparation and test shooting was coming into play. I was so familiar with these green screen setups that we covered most of the shots within the 3 hours left in that evening, which to me at least was astonishingly fast. I couldn't have predicted the pace of this kind of coverage in pre-production. This meant the final day of production with Sam and I would just be the smaller pickup shots. I was quite happy with my own performances here. I think I only did 2 or 3 takes for all the shots on myself here, and I felt as if I'd have a ton of choice in the edit with the little coverage that we did get on me. The performances we captured of Sam really elevated the script. On his final take, we discovered one of the key concepts of the story, that Sam's character would give up anything for them to be young and friends together again. This was a magical moment on set where he found a great emotional depth to the story and his own character. And I was really thankful that he found the deeper concept within all of this that I didn't know before starting this project. This was the most relaxed and fun day of the shoot, as the pressure was now off because I kind of knew we had the film in the bag. All that was left were 4 quick green screen shots and then we were done for the day. So we had wrapped the production by lunch. For me, it's always a great feeling to finish a production and know everyone involved had a great time and felt as if they contributed something with their own creative ideas to the overall project. And now I just had to do 2 small scenes with my nephew. However, he'd never acted before, so I had to give him some time and some space to warm up into it. He was an absolute natural on camera, and we got 2 really great shots on this final day of production. He brought a nuance to the character that I really hadn't anticipated, especially for a first-time actor. Once I finished a first watchable draft of the music video, I realized that the concept of our 2 protagonists being childhood friends wouldn't land for the audience. So I discussed this current draft with my parents, and my father suggested I needed a device to help the audience put 2 and 2 together that was neither too literal or overly sentimental. It was my father's idea, not mine, to film my 2 younger nephews who are 3 and 5 years of age as if it were a flashback sequence of Samuel the Peacemaker and Coolio the Outlaw as children. Once I'd made the decision to go ahead with this new idea, I bought 2 children's night costumes on Amazon. Once the costumes arrived, I drove back to Kildare to shoot the scene. The idea was to film the 2 boys just playing in my parents' back garden, as they are so young, and I thought it was better not to direct them and just let them play with the foam sword and shields that came with the costumes. Once I filmed a couple of usable seconds that would fit with the concept of the music video, I would wrap them. All I would need was just a couple of seconds of the 2 kids looking at each other and smiling together. Fortunately, I got what I needed from the 2 lads within a couple of minutes filming, and most importantly, everyone enjoyed themselves. I shot the footage in 60 frames per second. However, in the edit, I wish I'd shot in 120 frames per second to add to the flashback idea in a more obvious way. 60 frames per second just wasn't slow enough to lift the idea, especially with the shortness of the clip. So I used the optical flow setting within Resolve to reduce the speed down to 120 frames per second, which really helped lift the concept. I find one of the most nerve-wracking aspects about making any film is the first playthrough of the dailies. I mentally have to prepare myself not to freak out until I've watched all the takes before concluding whether the film is in there or not. Generally speaking, I could tell during the shoot and wasn't too worried during this production. I've learned that it's a good idea to take a lot of notes, now even more coherent notes thanks to Notion, to keep the bigger picture of the film in the forefront of my mind and not to lose sight or get too distracted by the minor mistakes. So I was fairly delighted to find I hadn't made any massive mistakes during the shoot in regards to the cinematography of the green screen shots. All those weeks of preparation provided a platform for fewer mistakes. Initially, I had quite an awkward setup of watching all the files. The green screen footage was reviewed in a Premiere Pro timeline, which meant I could import those files into After Effects once viewed, using Adobe's dynamic link to start the Chroma keying process. The performance to camera footage was all reviewed in DaVinci Resolve 16, as this is my current NLE of choice, due to its powerful color grading capabilities and faster export times than any other NLE. Once I finished keying all the green screen footage in After Effects, I would then import all those takes into a new folder within DaVinci Resolve. I had done as much preparation for this part of the post-production workflow as I could prior to this phase of the project. All the Witcher footage was ready to be matched with my own green screen footage. Luckily, I'd lit my green screen shots during production to a very high standard, so matching these with the Witcher footage was for the most part a very pleasurable experience, albeit I spent hours just working on single scenes at a time. I started to get really excited once I'd composited the first few scenes. I couldn't get over how realistic and cinematic they were looking. I was constantly asking myself the question, would an average audience member be able to tell whether this was green screened or shot on location? I started to wonder if people would question how I achieved such a high production quality and value on such a super low budget for this film, and that really got me excited. I think I'm going to make a separate video covering all the keying techniques I used for this film, as there's just far too much to cover in this BTS video. If anyone's interested, drop a comment down below in regards to what you'd like to see from a green screen breakdown. There was actually only 8 different green screen shots in total, but it took me a week and a half to have the final shots exported out of After Effects due to my lack of experience in chroma keying and a 4-year-old laptop with 16 gigs of RAM. This process took way longer than I expected it would. I reckon I would have halved this time if I were to start over again with what I know now, and I had a beast of a computer with like 16 gigs of RAM. One great lesson I've learned through all these chroma keying experiments is, if you want to retain the greatest image quality when exporting, you should choose the highest bit rate possible within your NLE. I exported this footage in a H.264 codec, and at your footage input resolution, this was 4K in my case. One thing I observed from these experiments is that no matter how well you light your green screen backdrop, there is always going to be a loss in image quality when chroma keying your footage. That's why you should always shoot with your camera's highest settings when green screening. So for my first export of this green screen footage, I exported it in 2K, and I realized the quality was not high enough because the bit rate was not high enough, so I had to go back again and export it in 4K, and that was a long process because I had to upscale everything, and that took me another couple of days just to export it in 4K, and then the render time, which I'll get to now. So I exported these composites using Adobe's media encoder at its max setting of 300 megabytes per second. It took 2.5 days to export this footage with my laptop running the entire time. The fan on my laptop was so loud, in fact, I actually had to sleep in a different bedroom. One of the wonderful aspects about pursuing an ambitious project like this one is that it was just out of my skill range. Problem solving involved pushes you to develop skills in the areas that you're working on at a much faster pace than if you just chose to learn the skill without a project in mind. Without this struggle and challenge, you wouldn't have the incentive to see how far you could push the medium. I think one of the keys to pursuing any creative endeavor is to choose a project just out of your skill range. This, I believe, is the sweet spot in regards to creative fulfillment. I had many creative insights during this project, which is always a good indicator of the personal worth in pursuing it. Whenever I focus 9 to 10 hours a day on a project, I'm generally hit by waves of insight I wouldn't otherwise discover from watching YouTube videos and reading books about filmmaking. Experimenting through trial and error is truly the best way to learn. Once I exported all these shots out of After Effects, I switched back to Resolve to start on the grade of the performance to camera footage. I'd originally planned to spend 4 days on the grade in total, but considering all the experience I have in this area, it just took me 1 day to refine most of the takes. For the other films I've made in the past, I usually start with the grade on the first day, even before I've had a look at the dailies. Then while I edit, I keep refining the footage as I go along. I think I'm starting to achieve a decent look throughout my recent films in the last few years. However, this method has been very time inefficient, but also bearing in mind I was refining my craft during the making of these films, and my eye and techniques have improved a lot since I first started color grading. And so now I'm actively trying to change that approach to better suit my current skill set. For this film, I wanted to get the look in the ballpark on the first draft to save a ton of time during the edit and to not split my focus between the two. I got 90% of the heavy lifting for the grade completed on this first draft. Here's an example of how I treated each of my images. One of the most enjoyable aspects about the post-production process for me is discovering something you'd never planned on during the production phase. One of these happy accidents was using the light rays effects built into the color tab. This effect really lifted the concept both aesthetically and narratively by complementing the religious motifs within the lyrics and overall concept. I hadn't heard of this effect prior to making this film, and I probably wouldn't have discovered it otherwise. I have to say it looks far better than I'd ever imagined in my own head, and that has a lot to do with the aesthetic of this particular effect. However, if I was to shoot these performance to camera shots again, I would have a front facing fill light on the talent to lift some of the harsh contrast off our faces. I think this would have offered an overall more subtle cinematic effect, as that's the kind of look you'd see in bigger Hollywood productions, which gives the impression of a higher dynamic range in the camera than it actually has. That's one of the reasons it looks so cinematic, and it was just way too contrasty in my shots. Another observation I had made during this phase is that my grading capabilities are much better than the skill I have as a cinematographer. I feel like I'm relying far too heavily on my ability to relight a shot in post-production. Even on set, I caught myself saying to the crew, don't worry about that, sure, I'll fix it in post. What this suggests to me is I need to spend more time behind the camera practicing lighting, framing, and working with different focal lengths. However, I've always been one to cut corners in everything that I do. My philosophy has always been, if I could get the equivalent results with fewer steps, I would do just that. So for my next film, I'd like to understand the language of framing and lighting to a higher degree and not be so lazy. I watch enough fucking tutorials on YouTube about the topic that I'm sure I can find the time to fit in 1 or 2 lighting experiments each week. However, being able to relight footage in post is a really great skill to have as a filmmaker, as you can really elevate the look of your film and project with this skill set. This is the phase of production I was looking forward to the most. In many ways, the pressure is kind of off at this point, and the next phase is just grinding it out on a timeline until you've reached the final product. This really suits my kind of personality, as there's a clear finish line in sight. And for me, it's all about crossing the line with a project, or it does not count in my head. Due to all the preparation I'd made leading up to the edit, it was a relatively stress-free and thoroughly enjoyable experience for the most part. I consciously chose to be grateful whilst editing this film, as I figured it might be a while again before I have a chance to undertake a project of this complexity and high concept. The self-talk would go something like this: how lucky am I to have made a film that I get more excited about with each and every draft. So for my first draft, I was cutting to the script, as it was really tight as far as I was concerned anyways. Once I finished the first assembly, it resembled something that looked like a music video, thankfully. I put all the green screen shots in first, as they were the skeleton of the story I was trying to tell. So I was constantly asking myself while cutting, does this shot or performance enhance the story? If the answer was no, I'd take it out and switch it with another performance shot that did. I was also trying my best to sculpt the relationship between Sam and my own character, and not rely on the cheap gags, which were funny in isolation, that we found on the day. I wanted a solid foundation from which to work off, so I would be able to give myself more options during a second draft. With this in mind, I kept reminding myself to play the story and not the joke, to have the confidence in the message I wanted to share with my audience, and not to rely on the comedy to carry the film. For the second draft, I was refining Sam's chorus to camera. Aspects I was considering while cutting were visual interest, emotion, energy, and conveying the overall concept of the piece utilizing the chorus line. It occurred to me during this draft that for much of the audience the lyrics would just go over their head, but the chorus line would be what would make it accessible. My hopes were that this artwork would be more accessible each time you watched it, and you'd discover a new layer of depth if it's in there. During this third draft, I realized the real potential of this project. I hate when you get to an edit of a film and you realized you're cornered into making certain decisions so that the story has some semblance of a coherent narrative. Fortunately, I did not have that issue, and I felt there were countless choices in regards to how I could best tell this story. All of the preparation I'd made during the pre-production and production had paid off, thankfully. And I felt as if I was in a complete flow state during this draft. I discussed this process with another actress friend of mine, and I told her how grateful I was to be in a space that felt like pure creativity, and what a sheer joy in finishing this project had become. Once I had all the intended shots in this draft and had sculpted the story in the way that I had imagined it in my head, I could now work on creating something better than its initial conception. This, I feel, is video editing at its best, when you start to generate something better than the sum of its parts. In Beetle the Bardcore's instrumental, there's only 2 bars of an intro, which wasn't long enough for my story. By the end of this third draft, I realized I would have to loop these first 2 bars to extend the introduction for my characters and general world building before getting into the main story, as the majority of the cuts are so fast that the audience needs time to catch up with the narrative. I think this was the biggest mistake I'd made in the entire project, thinking that 2 bars would be sufficient time for my audience to take in the world. I was really lucky I didn't cut the camera while filming these introduction scenes, as I let Sam and my own performances run on much longer than was intended. I had learnt this lesson 2 years ago whilst making weekly sketches, that it's a good idea to start shooting before action and after the scene has run its course. I ended up adding an additional 5 bars to the introduction. At first it was just 2 extra bars, and after a few more iterations I came to this magic number of 5 bars. Being honest here, I was trying to solve this introduction problem for weeks. I just couldn't decide on the order and the lengths of the scenes. Bear in mind here that I was cutting to the beat to engage the audience from the outset. The rhythm is a key device here to set up the world. This limitation of being boxed into cutting to the rhythm forced me to search for creative solutions to the bigger problem of the initial world building. This hard craft led to an intro I believe was much better than I had originally written. Ultimately, it had become much greater than the sum of its parts. For me, it's now actually the strongest part of the music video, and that's because of the graft that I put into crafting it. I originally intended to conclude the music video with a funny gag of Coolio stealing Sam's bazooki after he's killed him. When this idea occurred to me while writing the script, I thought it was a surprising ending and a truthful action for the character to do. However, during these last few drafts, I started to wonder if I should take it out entirely, as it started to feel like my character wouldn't do that after the journey they'd gone on together now. So when I started to show friends, colleagues, or family members this draft, I would watch them as they'd experience it for the first time, so I could see what parts were not working for them. I knew I was stuck in the way in which I was viewing it. And this is a massive problem you'll eventually run into while cutting a film if you're being honest with yourself. By watching your audience watch your draft, you'll see the different ways of experiencing it for yourself and ultimately a new perspective. This then changes the context of how you work on the next draft. One thing I observed was, as soon as Sam is killed, they would turn away from the screen and start to give me their advice while the video continued to play. The film had resolved itself for the audience as soon as Sam had died. This became a great clue as to how I should reshape the video. After an in-depth conversation I had with my uncle about the draft, and in particular the ending, he concluded his critique with suggestions of what would best serve the relationship of the characters rather than a funny punchline, and I totally agreed with his viewpoint. The interesting insight here is I kind of felt this while editing, that I shouldn't play the gag, but I guess I wasn't confident enough in the story to take out the final punchline. I was also torn between leaving Sam's bridge line in or taking it out. The con of leaving it in was it verged on telling the audience how to feel, but it did suggest a naivety to Sam's character which I thought was really strong. To think he could change Coolio, but Coolio was far too gone to ever change, even though they'd shared a moment of connection during the Parchment exchange. This new ambivalent ending was much richer, and I think I created a much more satisfying resolve with these two final adjustments than the initial ending I intended. I could feel this nagging impatience come over me during these final few iterations just to finish the fucking video. It gave me pause. Every day I would ask myself the question, am I finished yet? Which after some thought would result in a no. So I kept working, and then I'd make some more refinements that would elevate the video, and I'd be glad I hadn't drawn a line under it just yet. When I take on any project, I try to complete it as fast as I possibly can, because if I don't, it'll drag on for months, but I also want to do the best job I possibly can. So at this point, I set myself 2 goal dates to finish by. One when I'd like to be finished, and the other a non-negotiable deadline. Now that a clear goal was set in sight, my impatience finally subsided. Fortunately, I got some feedback off a filmmaker friend of mine before drawing the line under this video and uploading it to YouTube. He told me I needed to step away from the edit for a few days so I could come back to it with a fresh pair of eyes. This was hard to hear and flared up my impatience once again, but I knew he was right, as I've been staring at that same timeline for 8 hours a day for 5.5 weeks straight. I know it seems hard to believe it took this time to put together a 4-minute video, but I was determined to make it the best goddamn music video I could possibly make with the footage I'd shot. So I followed my filmmaker's advice, and it took 5 days off before cutting the final draft. During the interim, I was working on the marketing scheme for it and the IMBD credit and a high quality thumbnail, so no time was lost either way. Once I came back to the edit, I made some minor improvements and corrected some errors which I thought elevated the general flow of the cut. So it was a good decision in the end that I took some time off. Every creative project you pursue is going to be a risk. You could spend the next 3.5 months, as I did, without absolutely nothing to show for it, with an extra terabyte of storage space taken up on your hard drive. It's even harder to know whether you'll still think it's a decent idea worth pursuing 1 month into the production, or even if it's a good idea by the end of it. I know a lot of people who do a lot of talk about making creative projects, but the years pass by and they never seem to pull the trigger on it, or they can't seem to cross the line because it didn't meet their expectations, or the 1,000 other roadblocks you'll inevitably encounter along the way. There is no doubt that trying to make original work is a difficult process and an uphill battle. This BTS video only gives you a glimpse of the sheer effort it took me to forge this thing into existence. And it's only 4 minutes long. I was lucky to have a really talented collaborator on board who brought a lot of different skills and talents to the video that I don't have, such as talent for writing lyrics in early modern English and writing in general, and a note in his head. While writing this BTS video, I calculated how many hours I've worked on this idea from start to finish. Approximately anywhere between 780 hours to 840 hours. And this is only including the direct hours I worked on it, and not the time spent passively thinking about it, which I did a lot of that too. I really thought that this film would be a viral hit. That did not turn out to be the case. In some sense, I'm a little bit disappointed because I literally put everything into this project. But at the same time, I'm grateful for the audience it did and does have. And it's had really great feedback so far, with an even better like to dislike ratio, considering its view count. So I'm relatively happy overall. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to about Outlaw's Paradise in person had never heard of Bardcore before. YouTube nerds like you guys and myself might assume it's common knowledge, but to the rest of the world, I guess it's still quite a niche genre. I suppose I just thought it was such a clever idea and in the way it was executed. However, I'm confident that it's a good piece of art, and I'm by no means discouraged in making another film. This film marks the passing of the 1,000 subscriber milestone for me. It's strange to think I actually have an audience for my work now, when I've been playing to an empty gallery my whole life as an artist. The lessons you learn by completing a project just out of your skill range are next to none. For me, this is the sole reason that will drive me to make the next one, to push what I currently know into something more interesting. In imagining how the overall aesthetic of this film would look and sound is what drew me to this project, and what I thought would draw an audience to it as well. But the most meaningful part of this project was the emotional journey I went on of the character and the story. A childhood friend of a notorious criminal seeks him out in the hopes of ending his reign of terror. Unfortunately, he loses his life because of his own kind naivety and moral obligation to his old friend. And I feel that's a really sad and dark story, which I'm delighted I got the chance to tell. French director Robert Bresson said, "A movie is made 3 times. It's made when it's written, it's made in production, and it's made again in post." After completing Outlaw's Paradise, the film that I wrote in post-production is so much more interesting than the film that I'd written on the page. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one.